A very good morning to all participants and welcome to our webinar promoting a knowledge and technology-driven Southeast Asia. Welcome, and I have a few housekeeping announcements before we get the program started today. My name is Arndt Hussar. I'm with the ADB's Digital Technology Unit, and I will be moderating today's event. You will see that at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you have a button that says Q&A. That's where you in the audience can type in your questions that you have for our speakers, for the panel later. And please, as you do that, do address them specifically to the person that you would like to respond. The speakers will be able to see the questions, and we also have a team supporting us and making sure that we get all your questions answered. The chat button is disabled for the audience, but the Q&A will allow you to post anything that you'd like to contribute to the conversation. So after this, nothing much else to announce in terms of housekeeping. We'll get straight into the program. And I would like to introduce our opening speaker for the opening remarks, and that is Ramesh Subramaniam. He's the Director General in the Southeast Asia Department of the Asian Development Bank. And as Director General, Dr. Subramaniam oversees ADB's relationships and public sector work in all of ASEAN's countries. He's also in charge of ADB's support for all sub-regional cooperation initiatives in the region. And over the past 20 years at ADB, he has worked on a wide range of projects across Asia Pacific, with infrastructure finance among his primary areas of interest. He represents ADB on the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on long-term investment and infrastructure development. He has a PhD in economics from McMaster University in Canada, and also had postdoctoral fellowships in development economics, as well as corporate finance and industry at Yale University in the US and the University of St. Andrews in the UK. Without further ado, Ramesh, could I ask you to please give the opening remarks?
Thank you so much, Arndt, for that warm introduction. Greatly appreciate. Good morning or good evening to everyone. I see 167 participants. I'm very pleased to open this webinar on promoting a knowledge and technology-driven Southeast Asia. Today, we will be launching two knowledge products. The first is the Policy Advice for COVID-19 Economic Recovery, or what we've been calling as PACER, PACER, report on harnessing the potential of big data in post-pandemic Southeast Asia. That's the first one. And the second is a web portal of our Asean Policy Network, a network that we created in 2017 to provide knowledge solutions to the region by bringing together economists as well as policy-oriented sector specialists across ADB Southeast Asia operations, as well as other parts of the Asian Development Bank. Now, focusing on the first report, every day and everywhere, as we know, as the audience, as the eminent panel that we have gathered knows, knowledge and data are being generated, collected, and shared at an increasing pace to enhance service delivery, respond swiftly to crisis, and promote resilient economies, as we've seen, particularly in the last 2.5 years. Such knowledge or data could be about consumer preferences, patterns of COVID-19 infections and hospitalization, for instance, as we learned, or satellite imagery with granular pictures of devastations from natural disasters, which unfortunately, as we all know, have been quite prevalent in Southeast Asia. With advances in digital technology, real-time collection and sharing of such information and data with precision and details are now possible and can transform critical private and public sector functions and service delivery. In the public sector domain, the pace of digitization clearly accelerated during the COVID-19 pandemic, underscoring the importance of big data for effective and efficient delivery of key public services such as healthcare, social welfare and protection, and education particularly. And it is critical for policymakers across the sub-region to help pave the way for big data adoption, from strategic governance to building a data-driven culture. For instance, in the health sector, there is an opportunity to leverage big data from social media, smartphone applications to support policies needed to related to prevention, detection, and treatment of diseases, as well as rollout of vaccines, as we've seen in the last year and a half. Second, in the social protection sphere, alternative data sources such as satellite images and mobile phone data provide granular estimates to better capture the prevalence of poverty. Big data can also be used to improve the effectiveness of social welfare programs, as we've learned in the Philippines, in Thailand, in Indonesia, in Cambodia, and in many other countries across the region, as well as in other parts of the Asia and Pacific region, such as India, Bangladesh, for instance. Third, in education, the accelerated adoption of online learning solutions has generated significant insights for education policies. Digitizing public sector data and accessing big data are growing, and advancement in digital technologies could facilitate their wider application. At the same time, governments across the region need to lay the strategic and technical groundwork to maximize the opportunities of big data and mitigate any risks, including protection of data, ensuring privacy, preventing fraud, and providing cyber security. Now, in addition to the first report, which I just covered, let me underscore the importance of the second knowledge product that we will unveil today, which is the web portal of the ADB-supported Asean Policy Network. Here, as Bill Gates once said, power comes not from knowledge kept, but from knowledge shared. And the Asean Policy Network recognizes the importance of helping countries identify knowledge solutions and sharing such solutions through various channels, including this timely webinar that we are having today. So let me thank every one of you for your attention and wish everyone a fruitful webinar. Now, before I pass it back to Arnd, I should greatly appreciate the panel that has gathered here today. Ms. Emily Pagador from the PhilSys Registry Office of the Philippine Statistics Authority. We are very, very pleased to be working very closely with them. Mr. Tang, Executive Director of Techno Startup Center, Ministry of Economy and Finance, Cambodia, a country that we are working very closely, a country that's very, very committed to digitization. Kun Vinit from TDRI, Thailand Development Research Institute, and Ms. Ada Wong, Asia Public Affairs Lead from Sanofi, and our own Elaine Tan, who's advisor and head of the Statistics and Data Innovation Unit from the ADB. And finally, I should mention the phenomenal work being done by James Villafiote, who will be speaking after me, I believe, who's the coordinator of the ASEAN Policy Network, with Dulce Zara, our economist, working very closely with him, and with the support and oversight from Alfredo Figueroa, who's the Director of Regional Cooperation. I greatly appreciate, I shouldn't be bragging about my own colleagues, but they're doing phenomenal work. So thank you so much for this opportunity and for your patience in listening to me, and back to you, Arnd. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramesh. Thank you for these opening remarks, underscoring again the importance of big data and the potential that it brings to the region. Thank you so much. We are now going to go to our next agenda item, and as Ramesh said, we have a lot to launch today. The next one is the ASEAN Policy Network. Can I ask the team to now start the launch?
Southeast Asia is slowly rising from the pandemic, but the profound impacts of COVID-19 continue to affect families and communities. ADB is supporting recovery efforts through finance, knowledge, and partnerships. The ADB-supported ASEAN Policy Network was established to support countries in identifying solutions that can help return Southeast Asia to pre-pandemic levels of growth. Since the start of the pandemic, the network has actively provided analysis and assessments on COVID-19's impact to help guide countries' responses and ADB's country operations in the region. The network collaborates with other ADB departments and external institutions in providing cutting-edge research, reports, and workshops. The network has recently partnered with the ASEAN Plus 3 Macroeconomic Research Office and Aziz Yusof Ishaq Institute. The network has regularly offered a series of knowledge webinars. The Learnings for Economics and Policy or LEAP series offers new tools, approaches, or methodologies to strengthen government counterparts' economic and policy analysis skills. Meanwhile, the Southeast Asia Policy Talk or SPOT series facilitates an exchange of ideas and innovations between ADB staff and external partners on priority issues. The ASEAN Policy Network provides knowledge solutions supporting Southeast Asian nations' strategic priorities. The Southeast Asia Rising from the Pandemic report, launched in March 2022, highlights investment opportunities in public health that can increase preparedness against future pandemics and boost regional growth. The network's newsletter monitors risks in the region, incorporating current geopolitical developments. The ASEAN Policy Network is expanding to cover new areas and issues, and to provide guidance to help policymakers contend with evolving local and global challenges. Moving forward, it will continue to forge partnerships to enhance the reach of its knowledge solutions. Keep up to date by visiting the ASEAN Policy Network portal at seeds.adb.org/ASEAN-policy-network.
Fantastic. And in addition to this nifty video with the scissors, I also clap for the opening. Thank you so much for that very nice introduction to our new policy network. And the person who leads this work in ADB is also behind our report that we will be launching next. I'd like to now introduce James Villafuerte, who is a senior economist in the Southeast Asia Regional Department of ADB. He leads the department's policy network of economists, conducts research on economics and regional cooperation, writes the economic outlook and risk assessments, and examines policy and development issues in Southeast Asia. Before joining ADB, he was an economist at the World Bank and a senior economist at the Department of Treasury and Finance in Victoria, Australia. James, over to you for the introduction of our second knowledge product, the report that we are launching today.
Good morning, Art. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the warm introduction. My presentation today is based on the last of 4 reports from the PACER TA, which Ramesh mentioned. The PACER TA, the aim is really to generate knowledge solution to facilitate the recovery of Southeast Asia from the debilitating impact of COVID-19. The countries covered in these reports are Cambodia, Indonesia, Myanmar, the Philippines, and Thailand. Now, next slide, please. Next slide. So I'll begin the presentation with a summary of some of the key messages in the report. As we all know, and as Ramesh mentioned, COVID-19 has catalyzed the digital adoption. And the boost in digitization has put a spotlight on big data in particular as an important or valuable resource for public sector policy and management. We know that big data can enhance economic policy making in many ways. It can grant efficiency gains to public institutions. It helps us also discover new information, which facilitate the timely decision making. It also accelerate development effectiveness through projects and foster resilience to cope with future disruption. And more specifically in the report that we are launching today, we will show you the immense benefit that comes from big data in terms of optimizing public health, social protection, education services, and expediting the Southeast Asian economy's post-pandemic recovery. More specifically, in the health sector, big data offers an opportunity to use social media and smartphone applications to support policies related to, for example, surveillance, the detection and treatment of diseases, and even the rollout of important vaccines. In social protection, alternative data sources such as what Ramesh mentioned, satellite images, and even mobile phone devices provide granular estimates that can capture the prevalence of many social phenomena like devastation from climate change, poverty, and even supporting our rehabilitation work. Big data can also be used to improve the effectiveness of social welfare program. Next slide, please. In education, the accelerated adoption of online learning solution has generated large insights in terms of how we can improve education policies and use big data to improve outcomes in labor market through more efficient job matching. In the training and education sector, we can use big data to understand the needs and also to track the progress of students who are learning in online platform. And to realize all these gains in health, in social welfare, or social protection and education, digitizing public sector data is critical, and providing access to the big data that is growing can actually help the wider application of these policies. However, we must also be cautious because government need to lay the groundwork and the technical groundwork to ensure that big data use is not abused, to mitigate the risk associated with the collection, the processing, and the sharing of data. We need to enhance data privacy and regulations against fraud and cybersecurity. Next slide, please. So let me begin the presentation. So the background of the study is the several challenges that has been observed to emerge as a result of the COVID-19. The first challenge is really the need to increase health expenditure. As we all know, prior to the pandemic, the cost of health spending in the region is quite low. It's less than it ranges from between 1% to around 3.5% of GDP. We know that this is below the global optimal level of about 5%. And what we saw is that during the COVID-19 pandemic, we spent more to fortify our health system and to improve the health response during the pandemic time. The second challenge is that the pandemic has also reversed some of our hard-won development gains. While from early 2000 to around 2015, we have eradicated around over 800 million poor people from extreme poverty. However, COVID-19 has reversed some of these gains. The most recent estimate is that in Asia Pacific, around 78 million additional people joined the ranks of the poor as compared to the pre-COVID poverty estimate. This requires the strengthening and investment in social protection to enhance human welfare. The other impact of the pandemic also is the significant job losses that we've seen in many countries. In particular, the youth across the 6 Southeast Asian economies that we've covered lost about over 4 million jobs in 2020 alone, and a similar estimate in 2021. Next slide, please. And in our study, what we have noted is the use of big data provides the potential to generate over 100 billion worth of annual benefit across Southeast Asia by 2030. and this is broken down in terms of 25 billion possible benefit through data-driven technology in the healthcare sector, and 77 billion possible benefit through the application of big data in education. And this slide shows you the breakdown of the benefits in the health sector. In the health sector, the 25 billion estimated benefit comes from two things. One is the application of data-driven analytics in delivering public health interventions for at-risk population. So the estimate there is about $15.5 billion. The second estimate is the use of digital technology and big data to remotely monitor patient, and this remote monitoring of patient actually helps us reduce hospital visits. It also reduces the length of stay in the hospital, providing some efficiency in our health sector. The way that these numbers have been estimated is that the McKinsey Global Institute, for example, noted that when you use big data to analyze public health intervention in diseases, it reduces the disability adjusted life years. And what they've done is they've estimated that the reduction in disability adjusted life years, when you multiplied it with per capita income, and also when you multiplied it with the proportion of the population from these chronic diseases, that's how they arrive at the economic value of the application of the big data. In terms of the application of technology in remote patient monitoring, McKinsey also observed around 10% to 20% savings to healthcare system through reduced hospital visits, length of patient stay, and the number of procedures relating to chronic diseases. So that's how they've estimated these numbers. Next slide, please. And for the education sectors, as I mentioned before, a potential benefit amounting to around 77 billion contribution to GDP emanates from first, the use of big data in online job matching. So when we do online job matching, big data provides efficiency gains. They also expand the pool of experts from where we can actually select the candidate, and this generates around over 61 billion benefit. The other source of benefit is actually the use of big data and online learning platform, which provides personalized and customized learning to students and also to workers. So the benefits from online job portal, as we know, is mainly coming from efficiencies gain and also improving the compatibility between the job profile that are needed for the specific job and also the job applicant. The way this benefit has been estimated by McKinsey is that they noted the change in employment rate that will occur when big data and digital technology are applied in terms of this labor market platform. And then they provide, they multiply this change in employment rate with the per capita income to arrive at an economic value of these benefits. For the use of digital technology to provide personalized and remote learning opportunities for students, the approach used was the same. Basically, they estimated the increased employment from greater online learning tools. MGA estimates the personalized and remote learning would lead to about 0.5% increase in employment rate in high-income countries, and an even bigger increase in employment rate of around 0.9% in advanced in developing economies. These country-level estimates are based on national employment rate, labor force, and also GDP per capita. Next slide, please. So these slides shows you the different opportunities that can be offered by big data in the health sector, in social welfare and protection, and in education. As we said, the COVID-19 pandemic has prompted the increase of health spending, and this has really raised the quality and importance of healthcare delivery in the region. And big data can help healthcare services delivery in many ways. One, it could be used to strengthen surveillance, for example, for infectious diseases. As we have seen during the pandemic, for example, data on smartphones are used by health ministries to monitor the conditions of the population to detect possible epidemics in specific location. No? So, for example, geotagging in Thailand was used to detect the movement of possible infected tourists that enters the country. It can also be used for contact tracing, and it can also be used to deliver and implement vaccine program. No? The other opportunity for big data in the health sector is it can also be used to track non-communicable diseases through the use of predictive data analytics and predictive models that identify risks, the developing risk in terms of non-communicable diseases. Therefore, health practitioners are informed early on, and they are able to provide better intervention to patients. And as I mentioned earlier, a new area that has been evolving in terms of digital technology and big data is its usage in terms of remote monitoring. So this remote monitoring can improve the productivity of hospitals and healthcare workers. It could reduce patient in-hospital bed days. It could also cut the burden on emergency department visits. And in terms of vaccine delivery and in terms of strengthening the confidence on vaccine or managing fears regarding vaccine hesitancy, big data can also help ensure that, for one, the storage, the delivery of vaccines are provided within the controlled protocol of, for example, temperature, thereby the vaccine quality are assured. Now, in the social welfare, there are many ways by which big data can also contribute. No? Big data can actually be used to address critical delivery gaps in the delivery of social protection. It can be used to enhance data management and even the targeting of mechanisms. For example, at the ADB, and Elaine may know this, we've been discussing with Facebook how social media data can actually be used to identify the profile of possible individuals who may be part of a social registry for social protection. Big data can also be used to enhance program implementation. For example, we can use big data with the traditional analytical approaches to understand more the nature of poverty in several areas, and this was done in the Philippines, for example, where traditional analytical approaches and machine learning from satellite imagery are being used to have a better and granular view of poverty levels in the Philippines. Cell phone data can also provide insights into migration patterns, and this is being used in Indonesia. And these migration patterns can also help in providing assistance to individuals when disasters occur. Now, let me move on. Let me move on to the how big data can actually help in the education sector. As I mentioned, for example, data sets from online data portals can provide insights to gain a better understanding of employment trends or emerging skills demand in specific sectors. And this can be used by labor ministries in training their workforce to respond to these industry needs. In the education and training setting, big data along with data analytics can actually look at the student records to identify, for example, ingredients of why students are failing, or they could also help identify students that are in need, and they can actually provide better education services. But it is important for government to ensure that the access to smart devices and access to online learning to generate a big data is actually implemented. Maximizing the data amassed from this technological utilization to extract deeper insights into students' behavior will also be helpful. Next slide. Now let me go to the last slide, which basically talks about the 7 policy enablers, which are also critical for unlocking the potential of big data. The first one is strategic governance, and this relates to the need to create plans, roadmaps, and government strategy for the adoption of big data. The second is data availability and quality. This includes the adoption of open data policy, improving data collection, processing, and creating an integrated platform to allow different data systems to talk to one another. And also this includes improved collaboration between different sectors of government and even the private sector, such as the Global Open Data Index Initiative, and also using crowdsourcing to gather data from the private sector. And as I mentioned earlier, we also need to build the safeguard for data. We need to ensure that data are not misused, and this requires the review of existing data protection laws and data regulation laws. Then we also have the human capital as a lever for the use of big data. And here what we need to do is actually to develop the incentive to produce a pipeline of graduates and data scientists who can actually help us understand the trends behind this big data. Assessment of ICT skills and building the capacity for human readiness is also very important. The next lever for accessing this big data is actually allowing greater access to technologies, including the technology for the collection of data, cloud technology for storing data, and also technology for using these different data analytic tools. We also need to develop a data-driven culture. And this data-driven culture is actually anchored on our attempt to promote a more evidence-based policymaking and also establishing the ground rules in terms of how we conduct objective and scientific research. Last but not the least, we need to invest in ICT infrastructure to ensure that data storage, cloud computing capabilities, and also data analytics softwares are available to both government and market. Next slide, please. And thank you for your attention. And the last point that I would like to talk about is we know that in the region, digital divide is also quite important. And digital divide does not only mean divide in terms of technology access, but they could also be divide in terms of gender, divide in terms of age, divide in terms of geographical location. And we need to make digital technology and data more accessible to everyone. Thank you for your attention, and I end my presentation here. Back to you, Arndt.
Thank you, James. And I just wondered whether you'd like to comment on how the report links back to the policy network that was just launched, the activities that you are planning with the network.
Yes, even it's actually interesting that when we had the video up front, by the way, the voice behind that video is actually an AI voice. So you can already see the use of technology in terms of producing some of the work that the network is doing. But the way the network operates is we are really trying to develop an evidence-based policymaking, knowledge product research that support policymaking based on scientific and big data approaches. And we also collaborate heavily on other institutions that are quite strong in terms of these big data initiatives. And that for example, ISAIAS, we've engaged with them. We've engaged with Google. We've engaged with technology partners, Google, Facebook. So this is how we are trying to strengthen our use of big data in producing knowledge product to enhance policymaking in the region. Back to you, Arndt.
Fantastic. Thanks, James. And so we are basically going to be able to see more knowledge products coming out of this network, more evidence and information, which is already quite a rich series that you've produced recently, and this, of course, is one of the reports. There's a whole series that you can find on the ADB webpage. So thanks, James, and we're now moving to our panel discussion. But if just a reminder to the audience, if you do have questions to our speakers, please use the Q&A function that you have here in Zoom, which you find at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that and you enter your question or comment, you may address it to one of our speakers or panelists, and then we will try to get the question answered during our event today. I'd now like to move to introduce our first panelist, and I go one by one. And the first panelist is Emily Pagador. She is the officer in charge and assistant national statistician in the Use Case Development and Management Service of PhilSys Registry Office. That is part of the Philippine Statistics Authority. And Emily has worked at the Advanced Science and Technology Institute of the Department of Science and Technology for 20 years as a science research specialist. She has also previously worked with the private sector as an expert in project management, software development, and business process engineering. Emily, as someone who's been intimately involved in large digital transformation initiatives, did you find something in the report that spoke to you as a public sector professional?
Yes. Hi. Good evening to everyone. Okay. So the presentation on the big data is very interesting. In fact, there are some applications such as identifying beneficiaries, improve program delivery, and detection of fraud that actually aligns to the objectives of the Philippine Identification System. In fact, the way I analyzed it, big data partnered with PhilSys platform will actually enable government and private sector to identify and verify their clients digitally for both in-person and online transactions. The main challenge, though, is really on the readiness of the organizations here in the Philippines, particularly in interoperability, especially in the government sector, where some of our systems are still legacy systems. So that's it. So interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. And that's something you've worked on for many years.
Yes.
And of course, in PhilSys, you have the small data on everyone who has a national ID, which then in aggregate becomes the big data that we're looking at today. So thank you for joining us today. I'll now introduce our next panelist. That's Nguyen Tang. He's the executive director of the Techno Startup Center, and that is part of the Ministry of Economy and Finance of Cambodia. The center is the innovation arm of the ministry, supporting digital economy policy development. And he has led various startup accelerators, including Startup Cambodia, the national program. He led the technical team that built the Cambodia Data Exchange platform, CamDX. And Nguyen has more than 15 years experience in the software industry and was a lecturer on distributed systems and machine learning for more than 10 years. He received a master's in science, ICT, from Waseda University in Japan, and a PhD in computer science from the Dresden University of Technology in Germany. Nguyen, welcome. And my first kickoff question to you is, in your role, you link digital entrepreneurs with government. And the report talks a lot about the potential that a greater use of big data and partnerships can have on economic growth. Do the findings in the report reflect the reality that you see in Cambodia at this time?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ant, and good morning to everyone. First of all, I would like to thank to the ADB team for producing an excellent report, and it opened up my eye and also make use of the report for further providing the policy measure to support Cambodia with respect to the big data. And of course, it is undeniable that the big data is really important in today's governance as well as the business operations. With big data and analytics, the government can intervene any downturn to improve the public services. And for the business themselves, the executive team could have a better decision to maneuver their business operation to better fit their customer satisfactions. However, the main challenge that we have within the government at the moment is that we do not have enough data to be called it as a big data, and also a human resources who are able to capitalize the big data into the full potential. So that is why we need a private sectors, the entrepreneur, as well as the researchers in the firm to help the government through the partnership programs. I can give you an example that one private sectors offer a customized PAC system for the National Hospital in Cambodia. PAC system stands for Pictures, Archive, and Communication System, where all the images from radiology, CT scan, ultrasounds are digitized. And then there is a private sectors in Cambodia who are able to use the machine learning model to diagnose and also to provide the predictions the model of the disease. Although it is not a replacement of the doctors, but at least it can assist the doctor to be able to diagnose the disease much better. So the partnership between the government and also the private sector is quite important to solve this complex task when the government are not ready. So thanks a lot once again to the ADB team who provide this report. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and very interesting. You're highlighting the challenge of capacity, of readiness in government to use the data that is available. Very interesting. I'm sure we'll get back to this topic again later in the panel. Thanks for joining. Next, I'd like to introduce Elaine Tan. She's the advisor and head in the Statistics and Data Innovation Unit of the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department at the Asian Development Bank. So Elaine works on building statistical capacity in developing member countries. She undertakes economic research using new data sources and methods and provides support and policy advice to ADB operations. Earlier, she was a member of the economics faculty at Royal Holloway, University of London, and a staff of the Ministry of Trade and Industry in the Government of Singapore. She holds a PhD in economics from Cambridge University in the UK. Welcome, Elaine. And Elaine, we often talk about the potential of big data analytics for development finance. From a data practitioner perspective, was there something in the report that particularly resonated with you as a practitioner?
Thank you, Ant, and hi, everybody. It's good to be here, and it's good to hear about the report and to read it as well. One thing that does resonate with me is the part about data-driven culture. I think it is really important that governments and societies have the right data-driven culture, and it should permeate the whole of government perspective, from public servants who deal with data every day, how do they use the data to improve what they are doing, all the way to the highest levels of government who need to do the last mile. By last mile, I mean maximizing the potential of data by accepting the scientific process in deriving insights from the data, but also to commit to using the data and the insights when making decisions. And I think that kind of culture will take time to develop, but it's really, really important to drive the whole enterprise forward. But glad to be here, and thank you for the report. Well done to all the authors. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. And we will surely get back to culture during our discussion later on. Next, I'd like to introduce Kun Vinit. Vinit Tianvanshipant is a researcher in the Thailand Development Research Institute, TDRI. Vinit works on education policy reform with a research focus on building the systems that gather job portal data and then analyzes the labor market demand in Thailand. He's also designing a dashboard for school evaluation. And prior to this current role, Vinit joined Teach for Thailand as a teaching fellow. During a 2-year stint, he taught mathematics for grades 7 to 9 at Wat Pathum Vanaram School, an underprivileged school in Bangkok. Vinit holds a bachelor's degree in computer science from Mahidol University's International College in Thailand. Welcome, Vinit. And in your work, Vinit, you leverage a lot of this data from digital platforms, which find a lot of coverage in our report. In your experience, are the partnerships between private and public sector already mature in the big data space, or are they still far from it?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the nice report for ADB. I think from my experience, the partnership like from the private and the public sector starts to emerge, but it's from my point of view, it's still not as like the whole system of big picture. For my country, for example, right now, the big data like start emerging like in a project basis, actually. And from the Ministry of Education, for example, right now they start to trying to digitize all their workflow so that they plan in the future, like in the 5 years, they have like the set of the big data that they can analyze and can prioritize like the policy. So I think it's like the good side that they start to like emerge the help from the private sector.
Thank you, Vinit. So it's emerging, and I think that is something that we also see and kind of alluded to in the report, that this is something that still needs to move forward and improve. Thanks for joining us, Vinit. Next, I'd like to introduce our last but not least, Ada Wong, who leads on public affairs for Asia in Sanofi. So she drives the public affairs strategy and implementation across the region for Sanofi, which is a French multinational pharmaceutical and healthcare company. Prior to joining Sanofi, Ada was the head of public affairs and communications at Friesland Campina, which is one of the world's largest dairy companies. She has over 20 years of experience in public affairs and communications across Asia Pacific, and is currently acting as the chairwoman of the Healthcare Committee of the EU ASEAN Business Council. Welcome, Ada. Ada, I also have an opening question for you. And as presented, the report estimates $1.5 billion of potential annual benefits in the region by 2030 if public health interventions become data-driven. That's a really impressive number. What does this mean to you as a private business in this sector?
Thank you, Ant, and good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I think, first of all, congratulations to ADB on this publication. As you can see, that the areas opportunity identified within the publication is very timely. As all we know, the recent environment we have been living in the last few years. I think one of the key things is that the drastic impact of COVID-19 pandemic. One of the biggest topics is the importance of sustainable healthcare financing has been brought up by many policymakers and many stakeholders, including private sector. There are many concerns by many sectors how to prepare the next pandemic to come and how to drive more sustainable healthcare financing policy with the aging population and growing chronic and communicable diseases. This is why I believe the potential annual benefit in Southeast Asia, as shared by the publication, can perfectly demonstrate the data-driven public health intervention can play a very important role in sustainable healthcare financing by increasing efficiency, reducing waste, increasing outcomes for patients, and reduce burden for the healthcare system as a whole. It is a win-win-win situation for all sectors, including private sector. Thank you, Ant.
Thank you so much. And with this, we have introduced everybody and already heard from various perspectives on the topic. And I see that our participants are also quite active with the Q&A questions. And I have one here that I want to get right into the conversation. And that's mainly for our practitioners in data analytics. Maybe I'll pose this to Elaine. So the person here, Shalendra Karki, is asking, how can you actually faithfully execute this data governance or strategic data governance when the data has a lot of noise or is scarce. And that is particularly pertinent in an LDC, in a low-income country, lower development levels. Elaine, do you have any ideas on what you can do to tackle that? The noise and the lack of proper data gathering?
Let me first deal with the noise question, but thank you very much. I think it's a very insightful question. And of course, as a data practitioner, I would not say that all data sets or all data sources are equal. Some will be noisier than others. And I think it is up to the data practitioners to validate those data. And we can validate it by integrating it with household surveys, with other forms of data to make sure that they move in a similar direction before a COVID pandemic shock, for example. And as for data collection issues, the Statistics and Data Innovation Unit have been working with our developing member countries to build up the capacity in data collection. And we have been working with many countries on using computer-assisted programming, we call it CAPI, computer-assisted personal interviewing, telephone interviewing, as well as using tablets and web-based interviewing. And these are methods which we are hoping to pioneer and populate in our developing member countries so that data collection becomes more efficient, more broad, so we can pick up people who have been left out of certain surveys, for example. And we have been building capacity in that area. And we're hoping that eventually there will be better data collection methods. But I think the question is absolutely right. Using data, collecting data is not problem-free. And we do need practitioners to clean the data, validate the data, as well as to make sure that the data is processed correctly. So those are professional skills that still have to be trained up in our developing countries. Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine. And maybe I'll now go to Emily. I wanted to go back to the government structures, the data collection that happens at scale. And of course, you're very deeply involved in that. What would be the benefits and the challenges of developing and implementing a national ID system, which is something that you're currently doing in the Philippines? And you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much for that question, Arndt. So the field is actually, as we all know, is the PSA, for that matter, is the one tasked to implement the national ID system of the Philippines. So there are several benefits that a citizen can have having a national ID, because number one, the PhilSys can make more services accessible actually to the Filipino people, because it shall address the lack of identification among the Filipinos, especially the vulnerable sectors. And with the national ID, we can actually make the government services more accessible to them, especially our social protection programs. Also, it promotes ease of doing business, because the PhilSys shall provide the platform for the government and the private sector. As I mentioned earlier, it will provide the platform to identify and verify their clients digitally. Okay, and one more that benefits national ID, especially with the big data. Is that it can enhance the integrity of a service and reduce the fraud, because PhilSys can uniquely identify now each registered person at a national scale, right? With high level, it can provide high level of assurance, thereby by eliminating identity fraud, and it strengthens the integrity of functional identification registries. Currently in the Philippines, we hold multiple registries of beneficiaries in the social protection area. And all those registries are siloed at the moment. So the national ID or the PhilSys can provide the platform to actually connect these different registries of beneficiaries and really target who the identify and target the appropriate beneficiary, for example, for a social protection program or for a service in the Philippines. One challenge, though, that we are encountering with implementing the national or the PhilSys is on the readiness of the concept, actually, the acceptance on the concept of a digital ID system, because the PhilSys is a digital ID system. People are still keen on having a physical ID. Okay, so we have to explain to them that eventually we can make do with that. We can eliminate the physical ID since the PhilSys is a digital ID. But of course, related to that is also modification of some of the policies here in the Philippines, wherein, especially in the banking sector, wherein they still require for a physical ID that can be photocopied when a citizen opens an account. So I think that the concept, we have to be able to explain the concept of a digital ID system coupled with the big data, so that eventually we can actually target or identify the persons. And also there's the notion of when they get a national ID, they can be profiled now. And we have to explain that, well, on the side of the Philippine Statistics Authority, that's the implementing agency, we don't get to profile actually the citizens because we only captured 10 demographic information. It does not contain other information about the person that will actually, because what we believe is we only need information that would actually identify the person, but not provide the profile of that. So there's still that fear that when I register for a national ID or to the PhilSys, I will now get profiled. So I agree that we have to strengthen more the data privacy policy also here in the Philippines, especially on the side of data sharing among the agencies as well, so that we can well, sort of lessen the fear of the people that they will get profiled when they register to the national ID.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. And of course, you raise issues around trust, trust of citizens in government, and trust that their data is not abused or passed on. Because then, of course, we are talking about big data. When you combine data sets, yours with others, then profiling could potentially happen. So the trust needs to be built that the data is handled safely and securely, that privacy is respected, all of these things that are key elements to the ecosystem. I think this question is number one here, because we do have as one of the policy enablers the strategic governance arrangements for data in a country, and ID is so essential. So thanks for those comments. You have a couple of questions in the Q&A box for you to answer, if you can have a look at those. I want to move on to Vinit. Nonli, I had a question for you, which is more focused on the private sector side and how you work with the innovation and the technology developments that comes out of private sector. So how do you promote the collaboration, the innovation and technology development that in your work with enterprises and startups? And how does this improve the delivery of government services? How does it, your Techno Center operate?
Okay. Thank you very much, Ant. I mean, before I can answer this question, I mean, I would like to highlight some element that the Your Startup Center, where I'm coming from, is under the Ministry of Economy and Finance, and we serve the purpose. One is supporting the startup, and the other one is supporting the government, providing the policy intervention whenever needed. With respect to the digital economy, society, as well as the fintech, so forth and so on. So it would be better at the macro review first, and what are the government intervention to support the startup innovation, and deep down to what we are doing at the moment. The government of Cambodia has a big ambition to become an upper middle income country by 2030 and also want to become a higher income country by 2050. At the moment, we are only just the low middle income country, but hopefully that we can achieve this goal, although it's quite ambitious. Similar to other government in the regions, government of Cambodia realized the advancements of technology and innovation as a means to find a new growth driver for our economy. We call it the digital economy. In this trend, the government enacted the policy framework on the digital economy and society last year to activate the policy measure to realize our vision and to promote the innovations among startups as well as to promote the digital adoptions among the enterprise. And this is the basis and the fundamental for gathering the data that we can form a big data later on. If we do not start from now, we may not able to achieve the objective to collect the data and make use of the big data for policy measure as well as for the government intervention policy. So for startup, there are a number of initiatives from the government, such as creating the Entrepreneurship Development Fund, creating Khmer Enterprise, the Startup Center. Also, we have a Startup Cambodia National Program, and we also change the law regulation, for example, update the investment law, raising our competitiveness in ease of doing business by simplifying the business registration through the online portal. And there are more initiatives, so that these are the things that we would like to capitalize the startup to join with us, to join with the government in any field that related to digital, related to data, related to innovation, so that they can find the potential to be scaled up. And for the enterprise, although right now, I mean, majors of our enterprise are small and medium, but their role are very important. They contribute more than 58% of our GDP. So we have to at least bring them to adopt the digital technology, because the COVID pandemic I mean, we learned from the COVID pandemic that it was so hard that the enterprise cannot sustain their business operation without adopting the digital technology. For example, like moving from offline to online selling, and also provide a good channel for communicating with their customers and so on. So because of this, the government also rolled out a number of policy measures to support the enterprise, such as creating the SME bank to provide the loan to SME, and also provide the COVID assistance package to support the enterprise during the heat period as well, especially in 2020 and 2021. So these are the intervention from the government to relax the COVID pandemic to the enterprise. And moreover, the government also introduced the tax incentive scheme for prioritize the sectors like tourism. It doesn't stop there. The government also implement the Enterprise Go Digital program, which is very similar to the one that Singapore is implementing to promote the digital adoption among the enterprise, hoping that they can operate their business in a new normal, as we might not live the same way as we did before the pandemic. So as I mentioned earlier, it is the stepping stone for Cambodia to start digitalize in prioritized area, both public and private sectors. And from this concept, we also need to build the Cambodia Data Exchange platform to facilitate the data between the government and the government, as well as the government and the private sectors. And by doing so, hopefully that in a couple of years from now on, we can collect some more data, and we can make use of it in terms of the big data as a mega trend for the world right now. Thanks, An.
Great. And in this data exchange that you've helped build, currently, do you find mostly public data in the data sets, or who has currently offered up data in the exchange?
At the moment, there are only the data from the public data only. But from this year onward, there will be private sector, especially from bank, from insurance, microfinance. They also join with the government with the CAMDH, the Cambodia Data Exchange platform, in order to verify the data of the government, especially verify the ID from the Ministry of Interior. I mean, at the moment, we do not have the digital identity as Emily mentioned in the Philippines, but we only have the big data set to collect the people by demographic data as well as the biometric, but not use it as an infrastructure for the digital ID yet. So what we do at the moment is just, how can I say, a mean for verification. For example, if you would like to open a bank account online without going to the physical office, so that there is a way to verify your ID, whether it is valid in the system or not. And this verification is made through the CamDX.
That's very impressive. So it serves the KYC that you need to do in banking. That's very interesting. So this might attract the attention of Vinit, who's researching, labor markets, and of course relies on the availability of data for his research. I had a question for you around, bringing some examples. How is big data used in Thailand to improve education and labor market outcomes at this point? Maybe you can share some examples with us.
Okay, thanks for the question. So actually, from the work that I doing with the TDI to analyze the job portal data. So we have used the data for various cases, actually, that both in education sector. So one of the first example is that we find out the skill gap and in the polytechnic degree, and so that's the first thing that we find out, the qualification of the job and the curriculum that they teach in the polytechnic is start to diverge, not matching. So we have try to collaborate with the people who make curriculum for the polytechnic, and right now they start revising their curriculum. For example, one particular example is that the computer business degree. So they teach how to use the computer. So right now we all know that these are the common skill, everyone needs to be able to do it. So the polytechnic start to planning to change things from that degree towards more to be able to create know how to write basic programming. For example, that's the first use case that use. And also we also report this data back to the government when during the period of the pandemic. So they have the matching data from that the government does with the Office of Statistics when they do labor force survey, and then we combine with our data that we collect from the job portal and help them to decide which policy they need to enable to help the people during the pandemic time. I think that's one of the two common example that we have used data. And also another one is that when we find out that there is a change in the skill required in the IT sector, so we presented data for the Office of Labor to let them try to decide the short course that relate to the skill that in the job market that they want. So basically that's we try to be the person who help share the data to the organization to help them have the better decision.
Yeah, so a lot of evidence building using data, directly feeding into policy and change of curriculum. Fantastic. Thank you, Vinit. So far, we've kind of dived into the policy side. And I have one last question I want to pose to Elaine on that before I come to Ada with more private sector focus. I want to acknowledge Emily, who's answering a lot of questions here from the Philippines. And we have a very strong Filipino representation in the audience, and they're all asking questions about the national ID. I want to tell people that there is also probably a hotline or an email that we can get some of those questions answered, but Emily is doing a fantastic job trying to answer all those questions. Emily, of course, is part of the team that develops this and looks at the statistics behind it, but I'm sure she will try her best to answer those questions. Some of them are more related to process, and some are actually related to, the cybersecurity aspects around getting a lot of spam messages and so on. And that's, of course, in this world of data, it's all very important concerns. When we talk to citizens about big data and the use of information, maybe the mobile number, how is that actually going to get out there, and what are the dangers to individuals when all this data is gathered and shared? So very, very interesting questions coming in. Okay, I said I have a question for Elaine, which is still related to the policy side. Elaine, what's the role of big data and policy making? It's a more general question. Can you provide some examples of how ADB uses big data to promote what we're after, which is inclusive and sustainable development in the region?
Yes, thank you, Ant. I'm not sure if you can hear me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly fine.
Thank you, Ant. So I think we need to start by thinking about what policy is. Policy is oftentimes a very blunt instrument. Government decisions and programs will affect thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of people. But people's needs are diverse and they are ever changing. And what governments need to do then is to be agile and to frequently update and calibrate their policies and programs. So what this means is that government decisions do not need to know individual behavior. What they need to know is the sum of individual behavior, aggregated data. So when we use big data and there are issues about data privacy, we don't really need to know exactly what Elaine Tan did or An Husa did. What we need is to have that broad data set from which we could derive aggregated insights for policy making, because we do not use one person's behavior to determine a policy or a program. So from that, I hope that sort of segues to how we think about big data, how we use this big data. So if governments need to be equipped to fine-tune policies or to respond quickly, they need timely and detailed information from which to aggregate, analyze, and apply algorithms on to get broad insights. And this is where big data comes in, because with high frequency, governments can use it to track changes, because we don't want data or insights to be based on or policies to be based on data that are a few years old, especially where we have such fast-moving disasters or fast-moving world global environment like we have right now. And so with high frequency that big data provides, government can use it to track changes in a more timely fashion. And another advantage of big data is large variety. Governments can use big data to cover a range of policy issues. And I think the report did a great job in surveying the key areas of health, education, and social assistance. But when we have broad, a large variety of data sets, we can integrate them to shed light on where government should go in a whole range of policy issues. And that's another key advantage of big data. And finally, being big, having a lot of volume means that we can apply lots of machine learning techniques which demand a large data set before you can derive the insights. And having a big volume of data means that the government can also cover a large part of the population. But of course, in any use of the data, we need to ask ourselves who's left out of that data set. So for example, if we look at social media data, we need to understand that not everybody is on social media. And policies that are built upon social media data then need to ask that question, where are we blind to? Where do we need to supplement this data? How do we get that data? And how do we have a more complete picture before we apply a certain policy? So big data, it has great potential, but we also need to know that there are certain gaps that big data may have. And we talked about big data, satellite imagery, call detail records from telco companies and so on. But I think a great potential in big data is in fact from within the government, government administrative data, and all the administrative data that has been collected by different government agencies. If we could integrate them into one common database, that will have great potential in identifying the needs of the people quickly, as well as in formulating policy. And the first step is, of course, exactly what Emily has been saying, the national ID. In order to link records across different data sets, we do need an identifier. And a national identifier is one of the best ways and cleanest way to do it, because it's unique to an individual and you can link all the different administrative databases into one for policy making. Aunt, you also asked about how ADB has been using big data to help with policy making, as well as to support our work to create a sustainable and prosperous Asia and the Pacific. I think I would just cite two studies, two projects. The first is the development of crop maps. I think the pressing issue today is food security. With rapidly rising food prices, a lot of concerns of the governments in our region is how do we keep food affordable? Because that has real impact to the poor or even to the middle class. And of course, when we talk about food security, it's linked intimately to agricultural production. And ADB has been helping our DMCs develop crop maps. And these are maps of what kinds of crops are grown and when they are grown. And they are developed using satellite imagery integrated with survey responses, household surveys, for example, surveys of farms, in order to ensure that we could make a reliable crop map. And that kind of crop maps could be used to estimate crop areas, crop production, monitoring water use by the surrounding farms, impact on neighboring forests, for example, if you want to make sure that agricultural production is indeed sustainable. And ADB has worked with the governments of Laos, PDR, Vietnam, Philippines, and Thailand to develop rice paddy maps. And we understand that they can be used to boost crop production. And of course, having a crop map is also useful when there's a disaster. And ADB economists have used satellite data and household data. Again, household data validates and supplements satellite data to create a vegetation map of Fiji. And that map was used to study the impact of cyclones and to assess the damages incurred when a cyclone takes a specific path across Fiji. And that kind of information is really, really useful, because then governments can know where the greatest impact of a natural disaster is, as well as where to allocate resources in terms of emergency help, and also how we could use that information to support the development of insurance markets. Because if we know where the crops are grown, we know what happens in a disaster, how to value and assess the damages incurred, then that is a necessary piece of information for the development of insurance markets. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine. And of course, you're reminding everyone that big data is not just person related. There are massive big data sets like satellite, Earth observation data that are not related to people. It's related to vegetation, to geographical locations of certain geoformations and so on. So we have a lot of data that we deal with and that we can leverage that is not at all personal. There's one question from the audience around, it was actually addressed to Vinit regarding the digital divide, and that's something that you just brought up. The digital divide in the data, of course, also reflects the digital divide in terms of access to the internet, in terms of access to equipment, to mobile phones, to learning tools, really. And Vinit, I'm sure, has encountered that in his work on education. So that Thailand wouldn't be alone with that challenge. There's many countries in the region that on the surface have excellent mobile coverage, but then when you look below, you actually see that the low-income segments of the population still really struggle with the affordability of devices, affordability of data, and there are big gaps in some countries between genders, between whether you are located in a rural area or in an urban area. So massive issues still around the digital divide that then get reflected back into the data. And you pointed to the fact that we need to address that when we look at the data sets. I'm going to bring in Ada, who has been patiently waiting with the private sector perspective on the topic. Ada, how does a pharmaceutical and healthcare company such as Sanofi use big data and technology to then help improve the delivery of services in the healthcare sector? How do you go about it?
Thank you, Alice. It's very interesting to hear all this big data from a policy angles perspective. I'm happy to share some learning of what we're doing from private sector. I think disease awareness campaign amongst healthcare professionals is play a very key role in a pharmaceutical healthcare ecosystem, because we can share the latest information with healthcare professionals. With COVID-19 pandemic, I think the engagement we all see that has been moved to online with support of the big data technology. For example, data can help to identify what are the best engagement channels, what kind of communications materials, the frequency of engagement, or even engagement timing that we need to do with healthcare professional. With that, I think that it play a very important role in terms of resources allocation for the engagement with a healthcare professional. And I can share with you another great example is how to support the management of diabetes patients, one of the largest disease in Asia Pacific, by simply having flu vaccine alert during the flu season. As some of you may know, diabetes patients have 6 times high chance to get complications, such as heart disease or food infection. As such, it's very important for diabetes patients to get flu vaccine. Apart from all the government or education awareness campaigns, data have shown that a reminder from the doctor during a regular visit, diabetes visit, is the most effective means. With that, by simply just linking the data set, adding alert on the doctor screen when the diabetes patient pay a visit during the flu season, it can help to improve the vaccination rate for flu, reduce the overall healthcare burden. That's, I think, a great example to demonstrate how public-private can work together in order to reduce the overall healthcare burden as well. Back to you, Ant.
Yeah, can I ask a follow-up question on that? So you're looking at vaccine hesitancy and the issues around getting your vaccination, getting your medicine on time. Why is there a need to monitor this? Why is this so important? The vaccine sentiments.
I think as we can emerge and we can see that we see a very positive correlation of vaccine awareness and overall confidence because of COVID-19. All of a sudden, you have 600 million vaccine experts around the world. But increasing vaccine awareness doesn't automatically translate into uptake of other vaccine preventable disease. I think the latest example we can see is that in London, as we can see all over newspaper, they pick up the polio virus in the sewer system, and it linked to the case in the States. That's why it triggered the London government to implement an urgent vaccine booster campaign at children age 1 to 9. I think it related to the earlier part is how can big data to demonstrate and prevent outbreak. And with all these vaccine awareness and vaccine confidence actually play a very important role to drive vaccinations rate. But vaccine confidence is very complex and very multi-layer issues. It can range from total rejection, delay or partial acceptance. In the old days or traditionally, vaccine confidence is measured by survey. You can imagine that survey fewer attack times. When the data is available, it may not be able to reflect the latest sentiment or confidence, which are highly influenced by external factors. We can see that during COVID-19 time, when the vaccines come out, all these measures, how it's fluctuated in terms of the vaccine confidence. As such, I think not just industry, policy maker, industry member, we believe that mainstream and social media are a useful platform to provide a snapshot of the type of conversation driving the perception, the underlying sentiment in a particular group. And the reliance of social media for information and sharing of key data resources and indicator can provide a very good indicator for vaccine confidence and allow early intervention is needed. I think this is the background why Sanofi developed the vaccine confidence framework in the partnerships with Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy early this year. And with this timely data and insight, we can provide right content around vaccination, which is the right audience at right time. And based on the framework, we can see different type of vaccines, different type of conversation, different timing, different geographic location as well. And then we can't depends on the opportunities and depends on the insight, whether early intervention or different resources allocation we can deploy. With that, I think the overall objective from public health perspective is how can build a better vaccine confidence, and then we can have better vaccine campaigns along the life course in order to reduce overall healthcare burden and prevent the next pandemic to come.
That's super interesting. So basically it's sentiment analysis that is used around from social media to look at how people think about vaccinations. And then the next question is, of course, you have this data insight. You have created a very valuable insight from big data. Is it actionable? Who takes action? What are the partnerships around this index that you have developed, where then government or private sector, maybe even platforms and groups of private sector actors can take action on this insight? Fascinating. So that's probably way forward is to look at, how do we build partnerships around it? Which governments are aware of this index? And so as usual with these data insights, it's not just about finding things out, it's then taking it to the policymakers, which is the work that Vinit is involved in, really putting it to the education sector colleagues who then adjust the curriculum, or in your case, who are involved in the campaigns around vaccines. So fascinating insights. I want to bring back James Villafuerte into the conversation if he's with us. We have a question from Hai Lin, who is a reporter with Zing News of Vietnam, and he was asking, what is the most important area for policy reform that could promote data-driven applications? What's the most difficult area to improve in Southeast Asian countries in general, and then of course in Vietnam in particular? James.
Thank you, Arndt. I think for me the most important area in terms of lever to maximize the utilization of big data in policymaking is really the promotion of the incentive and the support for a data-driven culture. And I think there are two parts to this. Firstly, a data-driven culture, I think, nicely anchors with our preference for evidence-based policymaking that is objective, policymaking that is really grounded in real data and scientific approach. The second, I think, important point in terms of promoting this data-driven culture is providing the data incentive within the public sector domain, so that human resources who have this expertise and who are who wants to invest in this expertise are recognized and provided career advancement in terms of the public sector space, because I think the incentive is really important to attract people into this new area. Once they realize that being a data scientist is not just being looked at as nerd, but really as a very practical policymaker, I think we'll attract more talent into this area, because we have very little talent now. Even I think even within the ADB, we have very limited data scientists. Thank you, Arndt.
Yeah, thanks, James. Lots of interesting questions still coming through. Kunvinit, I just wanted to ask you about something that we heard about, and that's the Educational Technologies or EdTech Development Fund. How does that play a role in your work? I assume it's government funding. Who does it go to, and what does it do?
Okay, so EdTech Fund actually is the fund by the government to basically promote like any technological use in education sector. So this can be applied to like both like the teachers who want to like involve using some technology, so and they have like funds, so they apply for this fund to experiment and try to create like immerse some technology into the classroom. So it both be like in terms of the teachers, like for example, the teacher who want to teach like using mathematics, but using like the software to help with the student with the disability, for example. And also like it can be, for example, like my work with the analyze job portal actually is initially like funded by the EdTech Fund as well to help make it work. So actually that's the part that the government try to promote the use of the technology.
So again, this might trigger then the emergence of new data sets that you could be used to inform policy. And as an initiative like that, of course, would then benefit greatly again with this data exchange type modality that Cambodia is building. So I think the Thai and Cambodia experience, there could really be some interesting learning here. Non Lee, I wanted to follow up on our conversation around that data exchange. Can you dive a little bit deeper and explain how that will work? What's the purpose? What are the lessons so far? And what are the benefits from having such a platform? And then, of course, maybe we can address already the concern around security and privacy of this data that is shared.
Okay, thank you, Arn. I mean, to answer your question, I mean, I would like to highlight that, I mean, Cambodia has started implemented e-government project 20 years ago in around 2002 at the time. But we took, at the time, we took a decentralized, centralized approach, meaning that one authority implement system for the others. And then after a while, it turns out not so successful, but not so successful in the sense that the adoption is not really engaged, especially by the line ministry. So that is why now we change approach from centralized to decentralized. Decentralized in a way that we allow the line ministry to have their own initiative on developing a system, on creating a data to manage the data. So they have the full authority in terms of managing the data by themselves. However, they have one condition. They need to open up the data and share with the other. And so how to share? Because there might be a concern about the infrastructures, about the security, so on and so on. So that is why we build a candidate for Cambodia Data Exchange platform, that we adopt the X-road model from Estonia. You might know that Estonia is one among the countries in the world who can digitize public service for nearly 99% of all the public services based on the X-road. And we thought, well, maybe we could try this model because the previous model doesn't succeed, it didn't succeed. So why not this model? So that's why we adopt the X-road model. We build in the decentralized manner. So candidate is just a information highway for the data to be flow within one to another, where the ministry, the organization, including the private sectors, are just like a house that connected to the road. So whenever you have the data can be represented as a vehicle so that it can flow in and flow out through this information superhighway. And so the candidate is just infrastructure, it's also a technology, but it essentially backed up by the law and regulation. Although it is not at the level of the law, because now we are still young in terms of the digital law. So the government create a sub-degree. Sub-degree is a level of the regulation that is understood or maybe adopted by the government only, not go up to the National Assembly, but at least among all the government can use it and can make it as an interim solution before the law exists. So the data that flow into the candidate is legalized. You can it is legal and it is secure by the technology because we follow the industry standard, let's say encryption, digital signature, time stamping, so on and so on. And also plus with the regulation, so it is good enough to experiment with the public sector as well as the private sectors. And if this is successful, I think in the next couple of years, we will propose the relevant law and also update the infrastructure to the top government as well as the National Assembly, as we can understand the concern of the user of the private sector in terms of whether the data will be kept or not, and to what degree, and whether we have law and regulation to mention and specify, hey, this data, for example, related to financial transactions should not be exchanged on the data platform. That we will know in the future. But now at least we provide a test bed experimentation to support this concept. Thank you, Al.
That's really interesting. So you're going ahead with a sandbox or testbed type environment for government. And if I understand the concept correctly, it's the data is housed with each of the departments and ministries. It's not put on a central platform, but you provide the infrastructure between these institutions to exchange. All in the absence of a regulatory environment that prescribes everything. You don't yet probably have the law that mandates how an e-signature is meant to be treated and all that. It might come later, and with your experience, you're hoping to influence that policy development. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right.
Very interesting. And we are involved currently with the government of Vietnam, looking at the e-transaction law over there. They're also revisiting that and thinking about how to handle e-signature. It's a very much an evolving scene here in Southeast Asia, where still a lot of governments are regulating and legislating in this area, trying to figure out what's the best fit model for the economy, society, and for government to deal with the issue of big data and the challenges and opportunities. Emily, you've been so busy answering questions in the chat. I do have one more for you, which I wanted to ask around the national ID system. So, looking at the impact side, how can the national ID system help accelerate the economic recovery, the social welfare and social protection programs? And certainly that's something, as was pointed out in the presentation of the report, in the aftermath of COVID, we're all so desperately looking for pathways of recovery. What role can the national ID system play there?
Okay, thank you for that question, Arn. Okay, so the role primarily of the national ID or PhilSys here is actually identifying or verifying the actual identity of the person or of the beneficiary of that social protection program, or for example, for the special assistance program that was provided during the pandemic. So there was many people have actually lined up to receive their financial assistance. One of the challenges that our department encountered at that time is that there are so many Filipinos that actually lack identification or IDs. So with the PhilSys, we are providing identification for these Filipinos. So we provide the ID. In fact, eventually they can make do without the physical ID since it's a digital ID. So once we've rolled out actually the authentication system of the PhilSys. But with this, we can actually ensure the uniqueness of a beneficiary since there will be a common identifier now that would allow cross-checking across the different databases of beneficiary registries in the Philippines. Also, it will ensure that the individual that is transacting for a service from the government is the right person, since there will be a reliable authentication now on an identity of a person. And it's a secure authentication process. Okay, when we get to target the actual beneficiary, we get to eliminate one person posing as two identities in a record. We get to save up a lot. We get to save money and really give it to the appropriate beneficiary. One of the problem actually of our registries are there are double records in their system. Okay, and then there are registrations that there's one person that registered as two different people. So we get to eliminate those. And therefore, the benefits that is intended really for the appropriate person will be given. Okay, so we won't probably will get save up, or we will be able to really appropriate the correct service to the correct person or to the intended beneficiary. So that's one thing. So the national ID is fairly new in the Philippines. We've just started its registration actually in 2019. So the pandemic actually pushed us to register immediately 100 million of the population in the Philippines. So we really had to do double time. And right now we're able to register on the biometric, up to the biometric capture or the step 2, actually 71 million of the Filipinos. So some of the partners, development partners that we're talking with is the Philippines is acting fast with the registration. So there's some delay in the release of the physical ID, but again, as I was saying, we are improving on the system, and we have to really teach or inform the people that the physical ID is not that important, and that the PhilSys is really more on the use cases or actually the authentication process.
So the two systems are tied directly to each other, right? The physical ID and the digital ID, they link up directly.
Yes, they do actually. The physical ID contains the demographic information of the person, but again, the Filipinos are very creative. The physical ID, if it's not that secure, can easily be produced in the black market. But with proper authentication, and now using your PhilSys number and your biometric information, the biometric information are unique, we can ensure that the identity of the person is verified. And then we get to eliminate those who intend to commit fraud, right?
Yeah, you would be happy to hear that as a German citizen, I have recently received my ID with biometrics and digital ID behind it, and yet I failed to get a tax number with it. So the issues around digital transformation are not unique to the Philippines, or it's really all around the world where governments are looking to leverage more of these digital systems and generating a lot of interesting data along with it.
Yeah. Just to add on,
Yeah.
actually, there's a notion that once we get a national, the PhilSys up and really running completely, interoperability will be addressed. And I would like to clarify that there's another end in that interoperability, and the agency that would be integrating with the PhilSys will also have to be ready to adapt on the system of the national ID. So we want to disperse the notion, especially here in the Philippines, that, oh, since we have the national ID, interoperability can happen. So I've been working on interoperability for years, and really there's a lot of work to do here in the Philippines.
Yeah, I can imagine. So digital transformation, this is definitely not the end of it. It keeps
Yes.
on going. Elaine, what would be the key policy priorities that are needed to maximize on the benefit of digital technology, but also then big data?
Yes, I thought that the report did a really good job in talking about the next steps and the policy priorities. I would just highlight something that to me is a key priority, but it's not quite a specific policy. And it's a change in mindset that I think needs to be perpetuated across our governments. And I think it's really exciting to be hearing about what Cambodia is doing, taking the first steps towards having those kinds of databases set up and integrating them eventually. So congratulations to a very forward-thinking government. And I think we need to see more of that. We need to see an idea that data is often seen as a cost, right? The cost of collecting, storing, processing, and analyzing. And I think we need to change the emphasis a little and take the perspective that data should be seen as an asset. And therefore the cost related to getting these data systems up is in fact an investment. And if we do think that a physical infrastructure is really important, then data is in fact part of an informational infrastructure that is really critical for our developing member countries in the 21st century. And I love what Nong Lee said about the information superhighway. Yes, eventually we want to build up to that. And the first step is, of course, investing in the collection, storing, processing, as well as the human capital to do all that and to analyze the data. And that will yield dividends over the medium term. And Emily has already alluded to this when she was talking about implementation of the distribution of benefits. In the area of social assistance, there is, of course, the problem of inclusion errors and exclusion errors. Right? Inclusion errors is when we included people who are not eligible by mistake. And exclusion errors is when we exclude people who should have received the social assistance, but we have excluded them by mistake. And if we've built an informational infrastructure, it is in fact part of the delivery of a cost-effective public service. And that should be the perspective of our developing member countries when we think about how to use data to improve public services as well as to improve policy making. And I think this is really, really important during a time when we are thinking of a growing need for social assistance, coming up from a post-pandemic recovery, but also thinking through that there are debt sustainability issues that our countries are dealing with, that we want to be more cost-effective in providing public services, and part of it has to be building the informational infrastructure to make it more cost-effective. So I will identify that as a priority, and understanding that we are investing in the medium term, in the longer term, and it's not really just the cost of data collection or data analytics. I'll stop here, thanks.
Thanks, Elaine. Very, very nice plaidoyer for governments to invest into this space and to derive the benefits. And those should be much higher than actually the investments that are made. Non Lee, you wanted to come in. Please go ahead.
Thanks. I would like to compliment to Ellen and also Emily. I mean, to the Ellen, I love the way that you think that the data is an asset. And now it is the right direction, I would say, because as I told you before, when we build the candidate and when we build the base registry, and the registry mean the basic data for verification that owned by respective authority. For example, ID must be owned by Ministry of Interior, vehicle should be owned by Ministry of Public Works, things like that in Cambodia. Land record will be owned by Ministry of Land, health record will be owned by the Ministry of Health, so forth and so on. And if this basic data is available, then we can capitalize it and make use it in terms of the transaction. At the moment, we are experimenting with the bank, with the bank and the microfinance, as well as the insurance company. Whenever they get a request to verify the ID data to the Ministry of Interior, although now it's free of charge, but we plan to charge per transaction, let's say 10 cents US dollar per transaction. You can imagine 1 million transactions daily. Then it can, it can contribute to a significant amount to the authority who own the data, so that they can use this money to upgrade the infrastructure, to maintain, so forth and so on. And also can the government can also collect the revenue as well. That is the point that I would like to add on what Ellen had just mentioned. To Emily, in terms of the interoperability, yes, what we are doing now is try to interconnect system between government system, because government is they are working in a silo. They have their system, but they do not want to share. And the way that we ask them to share is to encourage them to say that, hey, when you are sharing this data, you are not only can get the benefit through the data assets model that I just talked earlier, but you also can improve the data consistency, because if there is someone who uses your data, they know whether the data is right or wrong, so that it can feedback and comment to you, so that you can correct the data later on. So that is the importance of data sharing in terms of the interoperability framework between one to another. Thanks, Anne, for the opportunity to comment.
Sure, those were very nice comments, and I'm sure Emily might have something to say on that.
Thank you for that, Nyan and Elaine. Actually, Elaine, you've put the perspective from the public sector on the delivery of the services more clearly, actually, and that is also the intention of the PhilSys. Okay, to really identify the eligible beneficiaries, so that the services will be more cost effective, as we say so. Yeah, and in terms of the interoperability, we have actually are coming up with a solution, actually, on the national ID perspective, of creating a token seeding services, actually, that we would like to offer to the other agencies. It's actually the seeding of the token derivative of the PhilSys number, and at the same time matching them. So we are trying to consider here, actually, the data privacy and the data sharing, and also with the limited information that the PhilSys have. It just contains 10 demographic information. And in terms of the sharing of information, we always keep in mind that there has to be a consent coming from the owner of the information. So the data sharing has to be, and in fact, even the data matching has to be triggered through the consent of the citizen that owns the data. So that's also one thing that we want to address in terms of providing an application that will enable interoperability across the different agencies and organizations. This actually includes the financial and the private sector also in the Philippines. So thank you for pointing that out, Mr. Nguyen.
Thanks. Yeah, there are lots of concepts that are behind the comments that are being made. One of them is ask once. If government asks you once for the information to be inputted digitally, let's say, what's your name and where were you born and what's your birthday, does government need to ask you again and again and again? Probably not. So there are certain principles that are ringing through your comments, why data sharing between different agencies is important, why citizens will benefit from it, and why there should also be less concerns about government sharing these basic data with each other. It becomes interesting when there are external parties wanting to access, and how does, for example, a private sector like Sanofi that has data to share, insights to share on certain hesitancy around the use of vaccines. How does that get brought into the picture, and how do we handle the exchange of data between these various systems? So we're really highlighting in this discussion very interesting tensions and issues that governments, but also private sector, are working on trying to resolve. Yes, Emily, you have another point.
There's also one point that I would like to raise here, and that is on the data harmonization. Because of how we capture the data, they are stored differently. So there has to be some point of harmonizing all this data, so that when we refer to one variable, for example, we know that this is the information that we want to derive out of that data.
Yes, thank you. And all this will ring true and be very important for someone like Vinit, who does research in this area, because the more accurate, the more well organized this data is, the more easy it becomes to derive, pertinent insights, actionable insights out of big data. I want to go to our last round of comments, and maybe I'll start with Vinit. Maybe all of you can just put out there a last thought before we wrap up this very interesting panel. Vinit, do you have a thought on what you've heard, what other panels have said, or what you would like to share with the audience?
Well, actually, I think just want to add on, like, for the another part, like from the company perspective of try to harmonize the data together and the government. I think I just add on, like, Thailand also try to. I think they start to try to doing like the open data, like they start like several years ago, and I just talk from my perspective of like the, let's say, people in the between of the public and private sector, that I think nowadays, like in Thailand, they have like the portal that's similar to, I think, what in Cambodia do, and there's some organizations start to like put the data to like the people to, let's say, use, but right now is still at an early stage, so most of the data are still like the basic statistic, for example. But I think I saw the movement that they try to in between the organization in the government, they try to make it sharing the data, but I think it's still like some, and I'm not sure I would say like the difficulties, because like the incentive of sharing data, like for them is kind of like have more work to do. And the last thought for the education part, like from what I experienced, actually for the sharing data is, I think there's a movement that they're trying to do that throughout the Ministry of Education. Like actually I from what I know that they start to, let's say, reorganize all the data about the teacher and as well as the student to make it like more streamlined.
So still lots happening in the education sector. Thank you, Vinit. I want to go to Ada. Your thoughts on this discussion as our last round?
Yeah, I think from private sector healthcare perspective, one thing is that now we're building the data infrastructure recognized important, and how to move to the next step is recognize big data real-world evidence as part of the healthcare reimbursement system. With that, it's a truly public-private partnership that to recognize innovative solutions, to recognize the impact, to bring a true impact to the patient and reduce the healthcare burden as well. Thank you, Ant.
Thank you, Ada. And you're, of course, highlighting the partnership aspects that also was very much a key message of the report, trying to understand how we can better partner in forming those coalitions and partnerships. Can I go to Emily for your last thoughts?
trying to answer a question earlier posted in the, anyway, there's a lot to do in the public sector of the Philippines, but we hope that with the national ID we can actually enable the different sectors to do data sharing. But at the same time, well, considering the data privacy policies also here in the Philippines, and the big data really has a big role on this in establishing sound policy and implementation plans as well. So we hope. There are a lot of questions thrown in the chat, the Q&A box about the national ID. So I would just like to plug here also that if there are any questions, they can actually email info@philsys.gov.ph, or they can call our hotline 1388 for any questions regarding their physical ID, delivery of their physical ID. But otherwise, we are working double time to actually come out with the different use cases that we can implement so that we will be able to harness more the benefits of big data.
Fantastic, Emily. We're all watching from the sidelines on how you do, and good luck with your path towards getting it fully implemented, which sounds like you're well on track. Congratulations on that. All right, Nguyen Ly, you also presented fascinating progress from Cambodia. What are your last thoughts in this conversation?
Yes, I mean, big data is not a thought in our head anymore. I mean, for Cambodia, it's just a matter of the implementation. We start implementing gradually, starting from small and expand it gradually. And we grew based on the CamDX, the data exchange platform, and encourage the ministry who own the base registry, as I mentioned, the Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Land, Ministry of Public Work, that hold the base registry of the data to be on board with the CamDX, and then we can make use for the data verification later. And from this onward, we can expect to open it up to the private sectors. So there will be more innovation coming up whenever we open the data to the private sector. So now it's just a matter of how to implement efficiently in a short period of time to capitalize the big data. Thank you.
Thank you, Nguyen Ly, and we are of course looking forward to learn from this experiment that you're doing and see where it goes to in terms of regulation and framework setting. So that's really amazing. Elaine, your last thoughts.
I'll be brief. Data is an asset, and in the 21st century, it is as an information infrastructure is as important as a physical infrastructure, and that's something I think I would like to underline. Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine, and thanks everyone for joining us today, to the audience and to our excellent panelists, and of course James and DG and everyone else who contributed to the success of the event. Fabulous to have so many people actively participate. And with this, we are closing today's session. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.